Good morning, everybody. It's great to see such a great turnout for this topic. The conference organisers have asked me to just give a brief address to begin with, setting the issue of bushfires in this state in a broader context, that is, what we might expect of our state and the world over the next few decades because of climate change. So I've labelled this, titled this talk Be Prepared, because this is coming down the track at us whether we like it or not. So I'll begin by giving a brief overview of what's happening with the climate globally, then in Australia, and then bring it down to New South Wales. Talk about some projections for changes in our environment in general and also changes in fire risk. And then very briefly at the end talk about the implications of this for both biodiversity and emergency management, but I won't dwell on that, of course, because there are people here far more expert than I on that topic. So this is what's been happening to the global climate. This graph shows that each one of the bars on this graph is a temperature of a year going back to the 1800s. The blue bars are all the years of below average temperature, the average being measured over that entire period, and the red bars are the years where the temperature has been above average. And the trend is fairly obvious, at least obvious to us. Up till about 1930, all the years were below average temperatures. Between 1930 and about the mid-70s, there was a mixture. And post that period, all of the years have been above average in temperature, and in fact 14 of the 15 hottest years in recorded history have occurred this century. The little black wiggly line at the bottom of that graph is those temperatures that we've had so far. We are there. What this graph shows is two possible alternative futures for the planet. The blue band is the possible future if we are able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions sufficiently to stay below what's called the 2-degree guardrail, that is 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. And a lot of that will depend on the success or otherwise of the talks in Paris at the end of this year. The red band is what we call the business as usual scenario. That will be the temperatures experienced going forward into this century if we keep producing greenhouse gases at the current rate. Much as we would all like to remain below that 2-degree target, most of the science is pointing to at least a 4-degree world by the end of this century. Coming down to New South Wales then, as you can see, because there's less data in New South Wales than there is for the world, as you might expect, the picture is somewhat more variable. But nonetheless, you can see that until about the 1990s or so, there was temperatures below and above average. Since the 1990s, no temperatures below average. If you look at the most extreme right-hand side of that graph, you'll see 2013, which was the warmest year on record in Australia, where we had the hottest day, the hottest summer, the hottest month, and also the hottest New South Wales. This is just an infographic from the Climate Council that I'll talk a little bit about later, just showing that Australia all over is experiencing longer, hotter, drier and more extensive and more early heat waves all around the country. And just to show that I haven't been cherry-picking these numbers, what this graph shows is the number of days each year when Australia's daily mean temperature is sort of extreme, above the 99th percentile, and of course it varies from year to year, but the upwards trend of the numbers of days of extreme heat is fairly clear from this graph. Our rainfall has also been changing depending on where you are in the country. Some places have been getting wetter and others drier. So the grey bluey colours are the bits that have been getting wetter, and the red and yellow are the bits that have been getting drier. These two maps split off the temperatures from October to April and April to September. For New South Wales, of course, as you can see, we've been in a fairly long-term drying trend. These figures go back to it compares the period right back to 1900. So the southwest, the southeast and other parts of the eastern coast have been getting drier. The northwest areas and parts of the central areas have been getting wetter. These are the observed trends in the Forest Fire Danger Index, which, as I'm sure virtually everybody in this room will understand, is a composite measure of fire risk weather on any particular day. They've been mapped and analysed at 38 different weather stations across Australia. The round circles indicate where there's been an increase in the fire danger index. The purple filled in circles are where this is statistically significant, and the size of the circle indicates the magnitude of the increase. So the larger the circle, up to 600 times, is shown in the large purple dots. And once again, you can see that while there's variability across the country, there is a concentration of large purple dots in the southeastern parts of the country. Now for the future. These two maps show our current climatic zones and what we might expect under a fairly hot and dry scenario for the later on this century. The basic message here is that the climate zones are shifting southward. So what was generally cool is getting warmer, what was warm is getting very warm indeed. Just to give you an idea about the extremes, because after all it's the extremes that really count for all sorts of things. They matter much more than averages. This is a graphic from the last IPCC chapter on Australasia showing the days per year over 40 degrees. So just look at what happens to the red bits. This is the map for 1990, for 2050, and for 2100. It's getting very, very hot. This graph shows the number of people exposed to those temperatures in each of the different states. My apologies to anyone in Tasmania. It's not that you've been ignored, it's just that there's fewer people in Tasmania, so they don't quite make it onto the y-axis. But as you can see, the trends are fairly stark as you go through into different parts of this decade. The number of people exposed to extreme high temperatures in each state increases a great deal. Bad luck for the Western Australians, I'm afraid. Okay, so that's just the climate, but what does climate actually mean for what we will experience in our environment? I'm going to show you a couple of maps now, produced in a study by some CSIRO researchers a couple of years ago. And when I show you these maps, the yellow bits on the maps indicate the environment's kind of similar. The green bits indicates it's getting a bit different. The purple bits indicate the environment in terms of the physical environment is going to be really different. So I'm going to show you two maps, one for 2030 and one for 2070. So here's the 2030 map, and as you can see, under this particular climate change scenario that was used, the northwest areas of the country are getting the most different compared to what they are now. Here's the map for 2070. Basically purple Australia. And what this is saying is that looking forward into this century, everything will be different to what we are experiencing now. And that affects all our planning, bushfires or health or environmental conservation, absolutely everything. Another illustration of this is shown in the bottom couple of pictures, which come from my interpretation of another CSIRO study. It's called a climate analogue study, where CSIRO took various cities from around the country and said, okay, in the future, say under a 4-degree warmed world, what will that climate be like compared to known other places in Australia? What the bottom two pictures illustrate is some potential changes in Cairns. So Cairns is the wet tropics around Cairns, a marvellous storehouse of biological diversity in a 4-degree warmed world. With a drying scenario, Cairns gets the climate of Jabiru, which is shown in that other picture. So Jabiru's a dry monsoonal savanna. Nothing wrong with the biodiversity in Jabiru, of course, but I think you can understand that it won't be anything like the biodiversity of the Cairns wet tropics. This picture, just coming back now to New South Wales, shows the major bushfires and their aerial extent over the past few decades, just to illustrate that, you know, those of us that live in Sydney just tend to notice bushfires around Sydney, but of course bushfires occur right across the state, and in other parts of the state they can be very, very big in aerial extent. This is an infographic then that I kind of put together out of my head, really, for a climate change and fire report I wrote for the Climate Council. I'll mention a bit more about later, but it's really to try to illustrate the multiple ways in which climate change can affect fire risk. It can affect, in terms of the three major things we worry about: ignitions, fuel load, 4 things: fuel condition and weather. It can affect ignitions, not in terms of the number of 10-year-olds with a box of matches that go out and light fires, but in terms of lightning strikes. You get more lightning strikes as the weather gets warmer and gets more humid. Fuel load, obviously climate can affect this in different sorts of ways. If we get a wetter summer, for example, we get more vegetation. If we get a dry summer, we can have less vegetation. Fuel condition, however, is more dependent on the weather in the preceding few months, up and down. But the one thing where we can get a very clear idea of a directional impact is bushfire weather, and this comes back to that map I showed earlier of the Forest Fire Danger Index. As we get more extreme high temperatures, we also get more extreme bushfire weather. So we know that fire season is lengthening in New South Wales. It's starting earlier, lasting longer, not in every year, but in many years. Last year, we had 55 local government areas declare their bushfire season earlier than they usually do. This was the Australian Seasonal Outlook for 2014-2015 put out by the Bushfire CRC, which revised their figures for the first time and put out a second one. As our first speaker indicated, it was thought that we would get an El Nino in 2014. It didn't eventuate, but it is here now. In fact, I don't have a slide on it because the conference organisers were so organised they wanted me to send my slides in a week ago, which was actually before the formal announcement of the current El Nino occurred. So I don't have a slide on it, but it has been announced. We don't know how strong it will be. These next two maps come from a very useful resource. I'll put the website up later, which is the New South Wales NARCLIM project, which provides downscaled climate change projections for New South Wales. These are projections from that website from 2020 to 2039 and from 2060 to 2079. There are many other similar maps on that website, so it's a very useful resource for planning. We know that bushfires have enormous impacts on our health and our economy. These are just a few of those. We've had over 100 deaths since the 1920s in New South Wales from bushfires directly. The bushfire impacts on health via smoke, however, are probably more significant, though not as spectacular at the time. Reduced air quality increases the number of admissions to hospitals very dramatically, especially for things like asthma, but also for other respiratory and cardiac conditions. 2014, Deloitte Access Economics recently published a report indicating that the economic cost to New South Wales would be $43 million, with a tripling by mid-century. Much of this conference is going to be about ecological impacts about fires, so I'm not going to dwell on it. We know that fires reduce water quality in catchments. We also know that plants like obligate cedars are particularly vulnerable if fires are too frequent because they don't have enough time to regenerate and reproduce. And we also know that the fauna that is more sessile and of low mobility is at increased risk. So what are the implications overall for managers, which is why many of you are here? Well, of course, hotter and more frequent fires will drive significant changes in the structure and composition of our communities, some of which we can only speculate about, some of which we've got a fairly good idea about the directions. We will get, in many places, a decline in seed banks because of more frequent fires and potentially hotter fires, and those changed habitats will probably lead to at least local extinctions of many species. Of course, coupled with this increasing risk of fire weather is a growing population in New South Wales, projected to grow from the current 7.4 million to 12.6 million by later on this century. And of course, this is, and we have seen the increasing pressure on fire management agencies to perform more hazard reduction burning at that urban bushland interface, with 2012-13 with having the largest hazard reduction program in national parks, with more than 200,000 hectares burnt in that way. Finally, I'd just like to point out some what I think are useful resources for anybody that's not aware of them. I've just mentioned the NARCLIM website. It's a collaboration between New South Wales OEH and university scientists, particularly those at the University of New South Wales. Just Google NARCLIM and you'll find it. It's a very easy to use, user-friendly website with all sorts of information that I think you will find useful. The CSIRO and Bureau of Meteorology have recently updated their climate changes in Australia website, and that website now contains a vast array of incredibly easy to use and useful tools. Climate analogues, such as some of the examples I earlier spoke of. There is a threshold calculator, future projections downscaled for the whole country, all sorts of other exploratory tools, a very useful website. And finally, the Climate Council. I'm a councillor on the Climate Council. I'm sure that there are people in the room that have been financial supporters of the Council. Thank you very much. We've had a real focus since the Council started in 2013, followed on from the Climate Commission that was abolished by the Abbott government on its second day. Not that I'm bitter. Actually, it's been a wild ride with the Climate Council and it's been a lot of fun. One of our major themes on the Council is to emphasise to the Australian public the link between climate change and extreme events. And our very first report that we wrote was on bushfires, hence the Be Prepared. We have followed that up with a number of state-based bushfire reports, which essentially contain more or less the same information, but with state examples and state projections. If you go to the Climate Council website, you will find, I think now we have about 20 different reports and a vast array of infographics and other shareable material that you are most welcome to use. Thank you very much, and I'd be very happy to answer questions.